The Open Curtain, a novel by Brian Evenson. Copyright 2006. Beginning quotations. Beside myself, separated, I tried to annihilate myself, but I remained and felt myself to be immortal. Bonaventure. These perfect and private things, walling us in, have imperfect and public endings. Water and wind and flight, remembered words and the act of love, are but interruptions, and the world, like a beast, impatient and quick, waits only for those that are dead. No death for you. You are involved. Weldon Keys. Part 1. Rudd. Parsed. Chapter 1. Rudd found the letters early one Saturday morning among his dead father's dead things, kept in 5 collapsing boxes his mother had been meaning to throw out. He'd gone down to the basement for some other reason, but by the time he trailed his hand down the pocked concrete wall, reached the bottom of the stairs, he'd forgotten what it was. As he held himself still, gaze flicking about, he noticed, beside the water heater, the boxes. He opened one. It was filled with clothing packed in thin, dry cleaner's plastic, things he'd never remembered his father wearing. He removed 3 carefully pressed and flattened white shirts, a cardigan, a tie folded once and smoothed along the box's diagonal, 2 pairs of creased slacks, a thick woolen sweater, and a tightly rolled black belt. At the bottom was a 1954 Western States road map, attached to the bottom of the box with yellow brittle tape. A route was traced on it, in red pencil, from Utah south into Mexico. Removing the tape, he lifted it out. He'd been looking at the map for some time before he noticed the envelopes the map had been hiding. There were 3 of them, 2 addressed to his father from an A. Korth, their tops slit open. The other addressed by his father to Miss Ann Korth, posted but marked "Return to Sender," unopened. He blew one of the slit envelopes open, removed the single-page letter. It was brittle along the creases. He opened it slowly, smoothing each crease flat with his thumb. The handwriting was looped and difficult to make out, leaning off plumb and slightly forward. The ink faded into near illegibility. "Dear Guile," it began, his father's name. "Why have you not—" Then a word he couldn't read, a question mark. An entire line in the middle of the first crease, absolutely illegible. "Lael Grows is heavy, or perhaps healthy, and has asked for his father. Will you acknowledge him? I—" 2 words scratched out, then 3 illegible words written above them. "Tell him." The second crease, illegible again. "Duty to your flesh," illegible. "All my love, Anne." He took up Ann Korth's second letter, opened the envelope, but found it empty save for a single photograph of a child, 4 or 5 years old, awkwardly seated on a photo studio's blue shag before a modeled screen. He held the image up to the light, tried to see his own face in the photo, but could not. Setting the photograph aside, he opened the returned letter. Inside was a single 3x5 card, a short typewritten message on it. "Miss Korth, I reluctantly acknowledge the receipt of your recent letters. I'm convinced I am not the father of this boy. I believe you are mistaken in the man, and know enough of your true character to argue convincingly as much in a legal setting. I shall not reply to any more of your letters. Do not write again." His mother had begun to pile the counter's dishes into the sink. He looked at her back, watched the knitting needle twitch of her shoulder blades as she turned off the water, began to scrub. "Mother," he asked, "who was Ann Korth?" "When did you come in?" she asked, turning about, her hands dripping and held away from her body. She dried them on a corner of her apron. "Ann who?" she asked. "Korth." "I don't know any Ann Korth, do I?" He shrugged. "What do you have?" she asked. "What are you holding?" "These," he said. "Nothing. Old letters." "Of your father's?" "Yes." She held out one chapped hand. "Come on," she said when he hesitated. "They're not yours to begin with, are they?" "I don't think you should look at them," he said. She kept her hand out until he surrendered them. He watched her take the photograph out from one envelope, look at it, put it back. She unfolded the letter from Ann Korth, puzzled through it without comment or response, save for a tightening of the lips. "Well," she said, after reading the 355 card, her voice still strong. "There it is, just as your father said. She was mistaken in the man." "But, no buts," she said. "It's simple truth." Putting the letters together, she set them aside by the sink. "We know the truth. There's no reason to speak of this again." Chapter 2. For the moment, he just forgot it. That was the way he was raised. He'd always stood by his mother, obeyed her. He was her only child, she reminded him often, and the man of the house now that his father was gone. She counted on him. His father had become for him no more than a pair of dark shoes, a featureless face, an absence no longer palpable. It did not matter what he'd done or been. It made no difference to Rudd's life. He grew older, his glasses thickening and beginning to sit too heavily on his nose. He asked his mother for contacts, and she said, "No, darling," and pressed her hand to her forehead in a way that made it clear she shouldn't have asked. Everybody has to make sacrifices, she told him. He was in junior high and came home 2 hours before she did. While she was gone, he wasn't allowed to have friends in the house, not that he had any friends to speak of. He would stay in his room and assemble models, and sometimes, out of curiosity, sniff the glue. It made his head ache. Once some got on his wrist and it burned, his skin quickly blistering as he tried to rub it off first with water, then with turpentine. After that, his mother reclaimed the house key. He could either go to the library after school or wait on the porch. But if she found him hoodluming around, by God, he'd never hear the end of it. On Sundays they went to church, his mother sitting beside him through the sacrament service. When it was over, she walked out and down the hall with him, pretending to be friendly and loving, though he knew she was simply making sure he went to Sunday school and not out in the fields behind the church, as some of the other boys did, to smoke. In the classroom, he sat on one of the folding gray-brown chairs, tipping on 2 legs and looking at the words Edgemont, 3rd Ward, stenciled in a hazy orange on the back of the chair in front of him, waiting for his classmates to arrive and for the teacher to huff in 10 minutes late, loaded with pictures and paraphernalia she'd amassed from the church library that seemed to have no connection to the lesson. Her favorite lesson taught that if you listened to the Lord, followed the commandments, you'd be blessed. It was bolstered by tales of church leaders and members who'd done good and were blessed. There was something about a boy with a crippled foot and a baseball. She spoke rapturously about the crippled foot. Something about obeying your mother and later becoming a prophet. He'd learned by this time not to raise his hand and ask, "If people who are good are blessed, why was the prophet Joseph Smith shot to death?" He knew the answer, which was, he wasn't shot to death, he was martyred. When Robert Talbot, who had loaned him $2 once at school, was killed when his bike was hit by a car, he posed a similar question, and she answered with, "That poor child will have his reward in heaven." Loopholes like that made the whole thing fall apart for him. He wasn't sure what to do about the $2. Who should get them? If Robert Talbot was still alive, Rod probably would never have bothered to pay him back. He spent weeks in his bed, alternately feeling guilty, thinking of ways to do good with the $2, ensuring his own place in heaven. Then he forgot about them, went on to borrow other people's money. He would spend most of the Sunday school tipping his chair back and trying to balance on 2 legs, clattering down and up and down. The other children were nervous and excited, waiting to see if the teacher would tolerate it stoically till the end of class, or if she'd jerk him out of the chair, pull him by the ear to his mother's Sunday school class. There, his mother would pinch his skin on the back of his arm and pull him out to the car. "Your father is rolling in his grave," she would tell him. That was the only time she ever acknowledged his father's death, and she never did acknowledge it had been suicide. Rudd heard about that from the other children, who'd heard their parents whispering about it. A knife was involved, he knew, but little more. "You're my cross to bear," his mother would tell him. "A heavy cross." Likewise, he wanted to answer her, but he never did. He was not the only troublemaker. There was David Nimblett, Paul Boglin, Kathleen Dunbar. All of them had their moments and could be as bad as he was or even worse, though they would always stay away from him. He took the brunt of the blame, stood out that way somehow. They were all in 7th grade except for Nan Lutz, who'd skipped a grade in school and would have been in a higher Sunday school class, except that, as the bishop often said, the schools don't control the church. No such thing as gifted in church. Church stuck to the natural order of things. God went by age, not brains or brown-nosing. In 12 months, they went through 6 teachers, including Sister Thomas, who began to weep one day at the beginning of class and couldn't stop, even though they became saintly the second she began. Eventually, Nan led her to the bathroom and left her there. There was Brother Worcester, Pamela Worcester's father, who as his last act shouted to them all to hold their tongues, and when they literally did, told them solemnly and with a shaking voice that he had done his best by them, but they were determined to go to hell. If he had his way, he said, raising his arm to the square, they'd be in hell right now. Near the end was Dan Jarman, just back from his mission, young and sleek in a way the girls all admired, who suddenly stopped showing up. For 3 weeks they had no teacher. When the bishop found out, he took over, though he did not teach them exactly, but just sat with them as they went around one by one reading the scriptures, 1 verse each, round after round. When reading aloud, he found you couldn't pay attention to what you were reading. Your jaws were too busy moving and slipping around the words and trying to make the archaic sentences sound like they made sense. You felt no substance, but there was a formal satisfaction to the act. When at home, in his daily scripture study with his mother, he asked if he could be the one to read from then on. She was ecstatic, saw it as a sign that he'd finally taken an interest in the church. But it wasn't that, not that at all. He was starting to have an odd relation to words. Phrases from the Bible or elsewhere would catch in his head, keep circling round and about, digging a groove into his brain. The oddest little thing, just a phrase or two. Lo, verily, it was for a while. He'd be eating a sandwich or watching TV all the while, thinking, lo, verily. Then it was high school, 9th grade. At school, in physiology, he was assigned a table with Blair Manning and T.J. Hobbs. Blair had long hair that she curled under. She always wore jeans and a t-shirt, a silver choker around her neck. Sometimes she sat on her hands. She had a pair of tortoiseshell combs, one small, the other large, that she'd fidget with while Mr. Fresk was lecturing. Rudd tried to make it early to class so he could take the middle seat and be guaranteed a spot next to Blair. They started out dissecting a crawfish. By the end of the semester, we're all sharing a pig fetus. He called her once after the class was over, the beginning of the following semester, and waited on the phone until her mother found her. "Hello?" she finally said. "Hi," he said. "It's Rudd." There was a long pause. "Rod who?" Somehow he ended the conversation and hung up the phone without her quite figuring out who he was. His hands seemed too big for his body. Sometimes he sat on them, but not the same way Blair did. He tugged on his fingers and thumbs, trying to make his hands look longer, till at church David Nimblett began calling him Fish Hand, a name that puzzled him more than wounded him. He felt a little sorry for Nimblett, who was always nearly as awkward as he himself was, with even thicker glasses and fallen arches to boot. Rudd's mother told him he was becoming a handsome man, but his body hung awkwardly around him. He began to live furtively, traveling from locker to classroom without looking up. He didn't want to be noticed, yet he wanted to be noticed. It was either too complicated or too easy. He was sure it was worse for him than anybody else, though he couldn't explain why and knew he would be considered an idiot if he ever said this aloud. He was paralyzed. He gritted his teeth and decided to wait life out. Blair Manning was walking down the hall, and he was coming the other way. She was fiddling with her choker, looking at him. It was too late. There was nothing to do but keep walking forward. He'd have to walk right past her. She joggled one finger toward him and said, "Hey, I know you." He nodded his head, smiling but trying to keep his teeth covered. Her face lit up, and then she said, "Pig fetus, right?" And her friends tittered, and then she was past. He started feeling ecstatic and insulted all at once. That was the problem. Nothing ever came unmixed. He felt that it was his curse to realize this fact while not being able to do anything to make it more bearable. Everything was humiliated and yet desperately needed. He decided to try out for a sport, knowing in advance that it would be disastrous. He was a week late for football, so they gave him a helmet that was too tight, inadequately padded, and he stood on the sidelines during practice. His mother bought him wraparound sports goggles that he found on the first day he came to practice were several years out of style. After a while, the coach allowed him to run sprints. Then he stood on the sidelines some more. Someone, one of the seniors, that the coach called Wile E. Coyote, kept sneaking up behind him and hitting the back of his helmet as hard as he could. It made his ears ring, sometimes knocked him down, once knocked him out. He woke up to the face of one of the assistant coaches. The coach was still running drills. The assistant coach suggested that maybe football wasn't the right sport for him, told him to take the rest of the day off and think it over. He went home vowing he would work as hard as he could, prove to all of them he could do it. He would become a key player. They would eat their words. Instead, he shucked his uniform and never went back. Serving him breakfast the next day, his mother said she hadn't thought she was raising a quitter. "How does the quitter like his eggs cooked?" she asked. "Runny?" And later, "The quitter's actually going to drink all his orange juice for once?" He kept nudging at his plate until it slipped off the table and shattered. She stared at him, her face going white, then red. She turned away, steadied herself on the lip of the sink. He left the house. He wandered for several hours, down the streets that went through the river bottoms, along the old dirt track beside the creek, watching the water skeeters flit across the water surface, passing from sun to shadow. He tried to hit them with pebbles, then skipped flat rocks upstream. He climbed an oak tree, sat in the crotch of the branch until his leg fell asleep, then jumped down and limped home. When he was a sophomore, his English teacher, Mrs. Frome, praised to the whole class a half-page essay he had written on an Emily Dickinson poem. He was pleased and embarrassed, instantly worried what the others would tease him about it afterwards, which they did. 2 days later, Mrs. Frome was dead from an overdose of sleeping pills. He felt vaguely responsible. The principal, a hometown football hero now in his 50s, who had a dour, droopy face, decided to have a serious talk with the class about death. Death was wrong, he told them. Suicide especially. After closing the door, he brought out the Book of Mormon, telling them that normally school and religion didn't mix, but that this was a special case. The gist, apparently, was that Mrs. Frome was going to hell. Rudd's essay had been praised by someone going to hell. Did that mean that he was going to hell too, or just his essay? Rudd didn't know what to wear to the viewing, settled on a red tie and a white shirt, his church pants. He stood in line to get to the body, hands in pockets, wondering what he'd feel when he saw her corpse. Her face was pale under the rouge. He got his head down close enough to see the pores of her skin. Her eyelid, he could see, was just slightly open, 2 or 3 strands of cotton visible between the lashes. If there hadn't been people behind him, he would have touched her skin. Just thinking about it made him feel lightheaded. It suddenly became too much of a bother to get in trouble in Sunday school. Instead, he sat still in his chair, blanking it out, his arms crossed, answering only when he had no other choice. The answers were the same as they'd been when he was 6. Each year they were taught the same things over and over again in a slightly different format. Even the objections that some of the students raised, he realized, were objections that they'd been preconditioned to raise for years. Easy objections with pat solutions. He could rattle them out as easily as anyone. Teacher: "Does God answer prayers?" Class in unison: "Yes, of course." Teacher: "So if I pray for a red Corvette, I'll get it, right?" Class: "It's not a worthy prayer." Objector: "What if you need the red Corvette to convert someone?" Teacher, solicitous: "That would be a worthy purpose, but I can't possibly imagine a car is going to bring anyone closer to God." Objector: "What if you pray for something that God knows will be bad for you?" Teacher: "Like a red Corvette?" Laughs. "Then if you're worthy, God gives you what you really need." Objector: "So if you're not worthy, you end up with the car?" Teacher: "If you're not worthy, you end up with nothing. It's best to ask God to give you what you need to fulfill His will. There's no need to be too specific." Perfect, thought Rudd. Same technique fortune tellers use. One Sunday, their teacher passed out a slip of mimeographed paper, a genealogical tree on it in blue, slightly blurred ink. "Today," he said, "we're going to learn about family history." Rudd was instructed to write his parents' names in the first 2 slots. If you knew your parents' birthdays, or, he suggested looking at Rudd, death day, you should write that information in the half slots below, marked B and D. The full slots on the next column were for your name and the name of your brothers and sisters. Rudd looked at the form. He wrote his father's name in the first slot, Geil Thierer. He wrote his mother's name in the second slot. He crossed to the next column, wrote his name in the first slot. There were 5 other slots, all of them blank. He looked at the form. It seemed imbalanced, his name crowded at the top as it was. He began to write his name again in the second slot, then stopped. Crossing out the R and the U, he wrote instead, Lael Korth. Next to the B, he wrote a question, and then in parentheses, bastard. Beside his father's name, he drew in another line and wrote, Ann Korth. It had been 4 or 5 years since he'd read the letters. He was surprised he still remembered the names. He stayed staring at the tree, trying to figure out what it meant. Then suddenly the teacher was behind him, staring down at the paper. What's this? The teacher asked. Rudd smiled weakly, turning the paper over. You have a brother? Really? A half-brother. Your mother's never said anything about it. Rudd shrugged. It's a little complicated, he said. Later, when the teacher wasn't looking, he folded the paper once, then again, and slipped it into his pocket. That evening at supper, his mother brought it up. He denied everything. Brother Myers told me all about it, she said. He said you even wrote the word bastard. What kind of hellion writes the word bastard in church? Don't lie to me. He just looked at her, then looked at his fork. You don't have a half-brother, she said. I've never been with any man but your father. I'm not saying, to be vulgar, I've never had intercourse with anyone but your father. But are you accusing me of being a whore? He shut up. He looked at his hand, saw he was holding the fork tightly. Fingers whitening around it. He let it go, watching it clatter into the plate. Mind the china, she said. It's Dad, There are certain rules in this house. God damn, he shouted. I read the letters. I know. What letters, she said. I don't see any letters, she snorted. You and your goddamn, she said. The only bastard around here is you, and you weren't born that way. You had to grow into it. I know. There are rules in this house, she said. One of them is to treat the china with care. You know that. You know what the other rules are as well. I don't have to state them. If you don't care for them, there's the door. He was shaking, but he stayed seated. Later that night, his father in bed with a headache, he took the telephone book out. He looked through the Provo listings, went on to Mapleston, Orem, Spanish Fork. In Springville, he found an A. Korth. He dialed the number, listened to it ring. It clicked on, a woman's voice on the other end. Mrs. Korth? Ann Korth? There was a long static moment. Hello, he said. Please, he said, can you help me? You must have the wrong number, the voice said, and hung up.